Great, thanks very much. So I'm Alice Brett, and I'm going to speak to you today about really some lessons we can draw from our experience in the UK of building the RSE movement. And so I'm really delighted to have been invited here today to be part of this first German RSE conference. Our sort of German colleagues have been a really important part of lots of conferences and workshops that we've organised in the UK. So it's really brilliant to be able to come back the other way and be a guest at your conference. So yes, as the introduction said, I'm head of the software engineering group at the UK Atomic Energy Authority, but most of what I'm going to talk about today is really with my other hat on as chair of trustees for the new Society for Research Software Engineering, which has evolved out of the UK RSE Association. So by way of introduction, I'll just say a few words about my day job. So I work at the UK's National Fusion Research Laboratory at Culham in Oxfordshire. We do fusion energy research and also lots of work on related spin-off technologies that have applications beyond fusion. And on our site in Culham, we have two very large experiments, two tokamaks. The mission of the organisation is really to work on generating power from fusion energy, which is a long-term goal. It's been a long-term goal for a while now. We've got two very large experiments on the site. One of them is the Joint European Torus, JET, which we operate on behalf of the European Union. And the other one is the UK experiment called MAST-U, which is a different shape, different design of tokamak, exploring complementary things. And the group that I'm head of at UKAEA, it's a reasonably fast-growing group at the moment. It's got 12 members right now, split up into these three teams. And I'd say two of those sub-teams are RSEs. One of the teams has existed for a long time, since the very early days of JET, and they were sort of RSEs before the word existed, I suppose. So I say that they're RSEs specifically for JET data, and they're in charge of software that they've developed, and they have to maintain and support. So it's a different flavour of RSE role, I think, from the university groups. And so here's some examples of the kind of things they do. So just software for the entire pipeline of accessing JET data. So everything from storage, processing, discovering and analysing the data and visualising it. And more recently, we've established a second team of RSEs within the group, which was really inspired by my involvement in the wider RSE community. And this is operating much more in the model that the university RSE groups do. So as soon as we established this pool of RSEs that are available to work with researchers across the organisation on projects, the demand was really strong. So we've already hired 5 people. It's expected to be 6 by October, and there still seems to be a lot of demand for that to grow further. So in this section of the talk, first I'm going to talk a bit about the case for research software engineers. I don't think I have to make that case to people here, because you've all voluntarily come to this conference, but we've got quite a lot of experience of making this case to other people in the outside world. So I want to share a few things about how we can do that. And then after that, I'm going to talk about the story of the RSE movement in the UK, so drawing out some experiences and some lessons from that story. And then finally, I'm going to talk about some sort of patterns and examples of different ways to bring RSEs together in groups or communities or by activities, because I think one RSE is a very valuable thing and can make a lot of difference to a project. But to really have a wider impact on research, and also to have satisfying and sustainable careers for the people involved, there's a lot to be gained from bringing RSEs together and gaining that recognition. So firstly, the case for RSEs, and also trying to cover what we mean by RSE, because I think it can mean different things to different people sometimes, and how we can explain to people why they're important. So the argument really can be structured like this. So software is essential for research, but it's not always in a state that it needs to be. It's not always easy to get the software that you need for your research and to sustain it and to have it run and operate in the way that you would like. So for better research, increasingly important with the way that research is going, you know, the fact that almost all research is computational now and that research teams are getting bigger and bigger, it's increasingly important that better software is needed for better research. And for that to happen, we need access to these research software experts. And this might be computational researchers with particular niche expertise specific to their domain, but it might also be RSEs who can take that software expertise across different projects. And so what I'm going to try and do now is sort of talk about each of those 3 points and how we can convince people of that. So the first point, that software is essential for research. So when you're trying to convince people of that, maybe people who don't live in this world that we live in and don't immediately see this point as being so obvious as we would see. And I think it's very powerful to have a combination of stories and numbers when you're trying to convince people of things. So stories might be very well-known successes of research software. It might also be cautionary tales of times things have gone wrong, especially if they've gone wrong in a way that the people you're speaking to care about. You know, there's been some objective bad consequences that could be traced back to problems with the research software. And there have been some quite high-profile things like this in the news. You know, you can usually find some examples. And then sort of case studies. So it might be some of these high-profile case studies of very large software projects and famous examples, or it might be something that's very locally relevant to the person you're talking to, maybe a combination of both. But then also it can be very powerful to have some numbers and statistics to back up what you're saying, and it can be quite hard to define and come by such numbers that you're prepared to stand behind. So there's been a lot of work done by the Software Sustainability Institute in the UK, and a lot of this has been led by Simon Hetrick, who's here today in the middle. So if you want to know more about the details of some of these things, then you can catch him during this conference. So I'm just going to go through a couple of the headlines from that, but there is a lot more, and so if you go on the SSI website, you can sort of find details of various other studies that have been done. So here's one we use a lot from a survey of researchers. This just basically makes the point that almost all researchers use software for their research. A large majority of them would say that it is fundamental to the results of that research. It's not just an incidental part of the process. And more than half of them write their own code, and that's only increasing. And then another study that was done was some analysis of the text of papers. So this is just a way to try to determine en masse, you know, what proportion of research you could be said to rely on software. So this text analysis revealed that it's increasing very quickly, this incidence of terms that indicate the research heavily relied on software. And as of 2017, it's around about 2/3 of software had terms in the paper that indicate, 2/3 of research had terms in the paper that indicated a reliance on software. And then finally, this one's quite nice. This is sort of motivation for why do we need a name? Why do we need to unify around a term? So we looked. So Simon looked at the main UK academic jobs site and found 194 different job titles for people who were basically, in some form or another, writing software for research. So there's so many of these people, but they're often kind of hidden away and may not find each other. So that's a powerful one. So now this is about why, to have better software, why do we need better access to software experts? So how do we convince people of that? Well, there's a lot of good things, and I think we'll hear a lot in the technical side and in this conference about all of the things in this list, all these aspirations we have for what we would like good research software to be like. So we would like it to be correct, and we know that means we would like it to be tested, and for that to be possible, it has to be testable in the first place and written in a way that makes that possible. it really needs to be understandable because research is not an individual pursuit. It needs to be transparent how it's working, how the results were reached, and also for it to be sustainable, for it to carry on being useful after the student or the postdoc or the short-term researcher who wrote it has moved on. It's imperative that other people can understand it. And related to that is the fact that we want the research to be reproducible. That's fundamental to how we should be conducting research. And we know that the way the software is written has a very heavy impact on whether that is possible or not. We want it to be usable. We want it to be not just the one person who wrote it who can actually get the benefits of this software, because all the knowledge from the research is kind of locked up in this software. And if only one person can use it, it's very precarious if that person's not available, and it's just not having the impact it could have. Ideally, we like it to be reusable. So I think when you're trying to convince managers or funders, they're very keen on reusing software and, paying for something once and getting multiple benefits. But really, to be able to reuse it, it first must be usable in the first place. We also want it to be easy to change, because when you're doing research, it's not a static thing. New knowledge is being obtained all the time, and you need to incorporate that in your software. And so you need a software engineer involved who can design the software in such a way that you can incorporate this new knowledge from research. So they need to work very closely together to understand the ways in which you might expect to incorporate new knowledge, whether it's thinking ahead that you might want to include different algorithms in the future for a particular part or this kind of thing. So why is it so hard to have software that is and does all these things? Partly because traditionally in research organizations, this has not really been anyone's main job to make this happen. So we kind of think of a spectrum existing from pure software engineer on one end, who has nothing to do with research necessarily, to very traditional researcher with no computational sort of use at all on the other end. There's a lot of people who are researcher developers who do some programming, but their main focus is the research and the results. But there's quite a big gap in research organizations between those two ends. And really, this is the gap we would like to fill, because the reason that gap is a problem is that the career structure for researchers really discourages you from spending a lot of time focusing on software quality. All the incentives want you to just do the minimum to get the result and publish the paper, and it's the paper and the going to conferences and speaking about it that will further your career, not making the software in a good state that other people can use it in the future. And so, of course, there always have been people who've focused on software and have filled that gap, but it's often been to the detriment of their own career, and that's the problem we'd like to solve. So that's where this role of the research software engineer fits, right in the middle of that spectrum. And I like to use the definition of an RSE being somebody who combines professional software engineering skills with a very good understanding of research and an ability to collaborate with researchers on their own terms. So what do RSEs do? Because it's not always about the job title or what the outside world thinks. It can be somebody who is doing these things may feel themselves to be part of this community, whatever their actual role is. So I think building quality software with some focus on the engineering quality of the software as well as the results, and as part of research projects. So they're not an arm's length contractor where you give them a specification and some software comes back at the end and they're hiding behind a contract. They're part of the research team working together with the researchers. And there's not a hard line there. Everybody just has their specialism and is part of the same team trying to achieve the research result. And in addition to actually writing software, typically RSEs will do a lot of other things too around helping researchers, so maybe training and building skills, either by formal training courses or by pairing up with researchers and sharing skills that way. establishing good software practices within their organizations and things to support that, and helping researchers navigate the computing infrastructure. It could be a full-time job just to keep up with evolution in technologies and all the cloud resources that are there now, these kind of things. It changes all the time, and researchers don't have time to all keep up with that individually, so that's a valuable role. So after talking about that, I think I need to have a quick note about the name and the categories. I think it's already been slightly touched on. So, of course, people were doing this kind of thing before this term was coined. So there's a lot of people who've been effectively doing this work for decades, maybe in a more isolated way or without a word for it. So there's a lot of pre-existing roles and teams. And of course, there's still a lot of different job titles. Even some of the main university RSE groups, there's variety in the job titles. Some of them use research software developer instead of research software engineer. And this is not really the important thing. So I understand that not everyone can even legally use the term engineer in a job title. So it's a protected term in some places. I believe that's the case in Germany, but you're managing to get around that in some ways. It was certainly the case in Canada when I went there. And so I think the approach we've always taken is that the community is inclusive. It's the kind of attitude of the people and what you do, not what your actual job title or role is, that's important. But on the other hand, for getting this kind of recognition by the outside world and these improvements in career structures, it is really very useful to have a common name and a sort of vision that people can get behind. So using this term, even if it's informally and the job title on paper is something else, is a very powerful thing. So now I'm going to move on to run through a bit about the story of the UK RSE movement right from the early days. I wasn't actually involved right at the beginning of this story. I got involved a little bit later, so for a large part, this isn't my story. It's about a lot of people. There's some acknowledgements at the end and some further reading where you can find the names and so forth. It goes back to 2012. So the Software Sustainability Institute has already been mentioned. They've been a really powerful organisation in the UK that has, in a way, enabled the emergence of the RSE community because it was something that already existed, that already shared a lot of these same goals and already had people and funding and relationships with some of the important people you need to convince. And so this was very important. And in 2012, at the SSI's Collaborations Workshop, which is an annual event that you might be interested in if you haven't come across it, at one of these early collaborations workshops, some people got together and they were discussing, what are the issues in research around software. And this issue of career structures and a role for professional software engineers in research came up. And at that workshop, they coined the term research software engineer to give a name to this role. Later on in the same year, the first RSE group in the UK, so I think the first RSE group using this model and using that name in the world, was started, and that was by James Hetherington at University College London. And really, this was a kind of a new model for organising research software engineers in universities, to have a central team that could work across all the departments and have its own identity and its own pool of expertise. So moving on, there was a workshop in 2013, which was the first RSE workshop. It was a sort of a precursor to something like the conferences in a way, a smaller event. But it was at that workshop, the first time they got people who identified with this RSE term together, that the idea of creating a community to represent and bring RSEs together was born. And so that was in 2013. And in early 2014, the UK RSE Association was founded. So that this question that came up at the workshop, should we create a community to represent RSEs? Well, they did. And within 3 months, there were 160 members. So I think the answer to that was yes, according to the members. And it very quickly, they decided to become democratic and have elections for the committee members. So that happened later that year. So then over the next couple of years, it was sort of the early days of the association, but it was starting to catch on as a term and a concept. It was starting to get some recognition. And this was happening both in a sort of formal way. So people like institutions, so a few more RSE groups were set up in this period at some other universities. And one of the main research funding bodies in the UK, called EPSRC, created some dedicated fellowships called RSE fellowships, which had the same status and independence as a senior research fellowship, giving 5 years of funding and the ability to employ another person and so forth, but specifically for RSEs. And that was a very powerful signal that it was being taken seriously and backed up by the funding bodies. But there was also recognition being gained among individuals. So this tweet is one that we kind of save for posterity. It's kind of the first time that somebody who hadn't maybe been involved in the initial setup of the community and that wasn't necessarily known to those initial organizers, it just popped up on Twitter. This person has changed their job title to research software engineer. So it's really started to catch on. So then for the next few years, coming up to more recently, it's been a story of continued growth and more organization and starting to have things like the annual conference. So we've had 3 of those so far. It's been getting bigger each time. And the 4th one this year. And then lots more RSE groups being founded. And I'm going to talk about that a lot more later in the talk. And finally, bringing us up to date to this year. So the main focus of this last year or two really has been establishing this professional society. So I don't know if this says something about the relative processes in the UK and in Germany, just how long this has taken compared to how quickly you were able to set up your association and have a legal status in Germany. I'm in danger of getting into some cliches about efficiency and so forth. But in this case, it does seem to be true. It took, I think, about 9 months from submitting the application. We have to, in the UK, the thing to do is to become a charity. So our professional society is, in fact, a charity. And yeah, about 9 months from filling in the quite substantial initial paperwork and getting lawyers involved and writing constitutions. And then all that time to get it approved. And we're still not out of the woods yet. There's a little bit more coming about that later. But really, this is a big milestone for us to have this legal status as our own organization. And we hope this will become like a professional society for RSEs, like some of the other professional societies over time. So we like to include the graphs with how the community grows over time. At the moment, this is just numbers on the mailing list, but it's just steady growth and it shows no sign of slowing down. And there's now a similar number of people on Slack, about 300 active users per week. And the Slack community is an international one increasingly these days. So there's a lot of people on there from a lot of different countries, not just the UK. So yes, a little bit more about the Society of Research Software Engineering that we've just founded. So it's now been registered as a charity, finally, in March of this year. And it has these aims. It's a charity with an educational purpose. And the aims of the charity are to further research software engineering for the good of society. So pretty ambitious. But it's good to keep it general, because then you can do... It leaves your options open for all of the activities you want to do, right? So I think that sums it up. So as was discussed for the German association, it's very important that it's a legal entity and we can do things independently of any individual or any university. And in our constitution, we have provision for there to be elected trustees. So every year there'll be elections and half of the trustees will be replaced. So you get a little bit of continuity and you get some new people in as well. So the story of the last few months since we got our registration is really trying to gear up to be able to accept members. And that means all sorts of boring things have to be done, like setting up bank accounts and writing data protection policies and setting up systems to sell tickets and, just all sorts of things. So we all got together in London just a few weeks ago, those who could make it. And like you, we had to kind of borrow the central London premises of the British Computer Society because we don't yet have our own grand central London premises. I'm sure that will come very soon. And for an example of one of the boring things that had to be done, the other picture on the right is the paperwork that had to be done to open a bank account. And we're still waiting for this bank account, but that's, that's the stack of paper. So another one of our sort of current activities is preparing for this year's RSE conference. So there's a lot of people from the UK here, actually. I'm really pleased so many people could come over and be part of the German conference, as the Germans come over and are part of ours. And some of those people are involved in organising this year's RSE conference. So Claire Wyatt is one of the chairs of the conference. So if you're interested in talking about anything to do with the conference, she's around. It's on the 17th to the 19th of September in Birmingham in the UK, the same location as last year. But it's going to be even bigger this year, even better, an extra day, longer workshops, that kind of thing. And registration will be opening pretty soon, so watch out for that if you have an appetite for more RSE conference by the end of this one. So lastly in this section, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some other things we do as members of the Society of Research Software Engineering, and other people who aren't the trustees get involved in this too. There's a lot of work to be done when you're trying to change things in research institutions and the way things have worked for many decades and centuries. And some of the work, it's not technical, it's all to do with influencing people and convincing people to do things differently. And so it is really useful to have some people in the community who can do some of this work of trying to understand and speak the language of senior university leaders or funders or policymakers. So there's just a couple of quick examples about things that have happened recently that we're pleased about in the UK that have been a result of this kind of work. So just recently, there's a consortium of some of the very top leading UK research universities, and they're having an initiative which is really driven from some very senior, the most senior leaders of research in the universities. And they have taken it upon themselves to come together to try to do some things to recognize the importance of people who create software in research. So they've heard this story and they've recognized that it's important. And they recognize that it's important on a par with all these other issues they have to think about in running a university. And so they're going to launch this initiative at this year's RSE conference with a panel talking about the importance of RSEs and, crucially, how universities can support their careers. So that really feels like an important step and an important win for this kind of influencing, convincing people work. It really is the RSE concerns being brought into the mainstream of the concerns of a university, right along with those other top-level issues. And where these particular leading universities lead, others tend to follow. So it's really great that that's happening, and we really hope something will come of that. And the other example, in the UK, there's an umbrella body which now sits above all the different research councils who dish out the funding for research projects. And they're called UK Research and Innovation, and they're doing a 10-year road mapping exercise for how they're going to spend their government funds for research over 10 years. And they have things like technical expert groups who advise them. And traditionally, this would have been typically a lot of people who were involved in HPC, and they would have been arguing for, please buy us an even bigger, HPC facility in the next 10 years. We need to stay ahead of the world in the size of our computers. And of course, they were still there. That's still important. That's still on the table. But this time, there were a lot of software experts and data experts also in the room. And so it kind of felt important that that voice was there and that, we get to put recommendations directly into this roadmap. And we hope that this will in fact have an influence on how the funding is spent in the coming decade, and that there will be some software-specific funds available, for instance. All sorts of good proposals. If a few of them actually happen, we'll be very pleased. And the white paper from that activity should be published along with the roadmap fairly soon. So finally, in this last section, I wanted to move on and talk about some models for bringing RSEs together in groups, communities, activities that have worked. Models might be too strong a word. Maybe I mean examples, but let me see. So, well, this one, okay. So the first one is RSE groups, and sometimes we mean different things when we use these terms. So for the purposes of this talk, when I say RSE groups, I mean the kind of formal team that's part of an organization structure. So a team under the same line manager in an organization. I use RSE group to mean that one. And so this is something that's really been taken off in the UK in a very big way over the last few years. And so it's got to the point where it's not actually that hard to make the case to a university that they ought to have a dedicated RSE group, but that has not always been the case. So when we did need to convince people very strongly, these are the kind of arguments about why an RSE group is important, not just individual RSEs. So the benefits of being in a team with other RSEs, rather than maybe a single RSE being in a research group, or maybe as well as. But some of the benefits for the RSEs are that they can have a more stable career. You know, it can kind of spread out the peaks and troughs of the funding on the different projects. You know, you have a lot of projects you're involved in, and all the funding cycles can kind of even out so that you can have a number of posts that are sustainable, and you can give permanent contracts on the basis that these keep coming in. They have a peer group, so you've got people to talk to, people to learn from, people to review your code and your designs, people to share skills with, so you can bring in that person who's the expert on building GUIs at the right point in your project and not have to do everything yourself. And that kind of recognition and career progression and development, you know, that this is a valid role in research and that there is progression. And as soon as you've got groups and larger groups, there becomes, you know, possibilities for promotion and for supervising other people and this kind of thing, or for becoming a more senior level niche expert in some technical area. For research projects, there's benefits to having an RSE group to call on rather than your own RSE. You can get more flexible access to expertise. Again, you know, you might need different skills at different points in a project, and if there's a team there, you have more chance of being able to access those. You can benefit from some knowledge sharing between projects. If the RSE who comes and works on your project has also worked on 5 other projects around the university, they can tell you useful things that they're doing over there that might be useful to you. And yes, I covered that one, access to the niche skills. So I think what I meant by the first one, as well as the access to specialist skills, was actually the flexibility in the way you use them. So you might not need an RSE for the whole duration of your research project. You might need them for a few months at the beginning and a few months at the end, and it would be hard to do that by hiring someone yourself. And finally, for individual researchers, there's some benefits to there being an RSE group in your university or your organization. So if you're a computational researcher who does a lot of programming, but it's not your sole focus, having this kind of peer group of people, maybe they're running events, maybe they're doing training, maybe they have some kind of monthly meetups or something like this. You've got a bit of a peer group and people you can go and talk to for help and advice. There's a sort of focus for that within the organization. So I said this has been taking off in the UK. This is the current list of all the institutions that have a central RSE group. Of course, there will be RSEs existing at other places too. They just might not be in a central group. But this is really, at this point, this is almost all the leading research universities and leading research institutes in the country. And the ones that haven't already got an established group are very fast trying to set one up. A lot of places have hired their first RSE and told them, you're building a group now. And so that brings me on to the next point I'm discussing, which is if you want there to be RSE groups and you want the careers to develop and the role to spread, you need these people to take these leadership roles. And so every time you want to start a new group, you need somebody else who is willing to lead such a group and able to start it. And it's not always easy to do that, especially, it's hard anyway if you're doing your first kind of leadership management job. And it's doubly hard if you're also at the same time having to work against all the embedded structures of your institution and this kind of thing. So we have found in the UK that the peer support of other people who are trying to do the same thing has been absolutely essential in that. So there was a relatively small informal group of people who would talk to each other in the early days, and that's now grown into quite a large sort of informal network of people. So there's a Slack channel specifically for people who are either already leading a group or an RSE initiative or who are trying to set up something. So it's also for people who aren't yet in a management position but want to be the person that starts that in their organization, for instance. And we do meet up twice a year because meeting in person is another level of being able to speak freely to each other, and we operate this kind of confidentiality where we can be open with each other and we won't get each other into trouble, basically. So there's a link there. I think the slides will be shared. It's a long link. But there's a good article and link to some case studies of how a lot of the existing RSE groups in the UK were set up and how the people made the case to their institutions. And so that article summarizes what was learned from that exercise, which is quite useful. And so still on the theme of support for RSE leaders, there are a couple of workshops in the last couple of years that we've run to try to address this as well. So in early 2018, we ran the first International RSE Leaders Workshop in London. And so 41 people came from 11 different countries. And that was a really great event. We hope to repeat it at some point. No concrete plans, but maybe some will evolve out of this workshop, who knows. So that was one. And the other workshop we ran just more recently in the UK was for aspiring RSE leaders. So we identified this problem that there was such a demand for setting up new groups, and the groups that existed were growing and starting to need maybe another layer of team leaders or something within the group. And there were not at the moment enough people with experience of running them, but there's a lot of keen people, a big community. So we ran a workshop specifically for some of the experienced leaders of RSE groups and some of people who were maybe aspiring or considering going into that kind of position to get together for 2 days in a nice hotel. And we did a good program of some short talks and some discussion sessions and a lot of networking, because part of it is just for the people to know each other and to have some people to talk to and ask questions. And the slides from that are also available. So that's a lot about RSE groups in institutions. So another model is more informal communities and networks. And I think there's going to be quite a lot of talk about this as well during this workshop, I see from the program. So I use the word community to mean not a formal team in an organization, but people who might come from lots of different places, but get together around a common interest. So institutional communities, I think there's a session on this, in fact, I see. But quite a lot of places have run some kind of events for people who work on research software in their organization. And this is very valuable for networking, sharing knowledge, letting people find each other and help each other. And also for raising the profile, because, as we said, it can be hidden work going under a lot of different names. It's very powerful to say, look, there are 100 people in this organization who have come together to talk about software. And there's lots of different names and models for running events like that. And then there are some communities which may not be within one institution, but where people have come together maybe from a wider region or a particular research domain or some other kind of specialism. So a few examples I could think of are there's a London and South East regional network that Jeremy Cohen's going to be speaking about during this, I think maybe even in the next session. And that's powerful because London has such a lot of institutions in a small area that you can do something very well on a regional level. HPC Wales, so there was some funding to set up new HPC facilities in Wales, and there were RSE posts associated with that, and they're spread around a lot of different institutions, so that's a community that brings those people together so they're not isolated and they can operate as a group. And then there's the Digital Humanities RSE initiative, which is based around a research domain. I'm sure there's many more. This is just a few that I could think of, that examples of different things. National RSE associations, we talked about a lot, but I'm just noting how many of these have sprung up now. So Germany, the Netherlands, and the Nordic countries, and also Australia and New Zealand and the USA now. So those are the ones I know of. Maybe there's others under discussion. And more countries starting to have research software conferences or RSE conferences. So there's just an increasing program of things to get involved in. So that brings me to the end, really. So just a few final thoughts, really. I think this echoes what the German organizers were saying about at this kind of stage in the community getting off the ground and formalizing itself, it's really great if more people can get involved, more people can help, and there's a lot of different ways that that can happen. So I think part of what happened at our first conference was really getting more people involved, bringing people together. So a lot of people got inspired by that conference and went away and started things or joined in things or just talked to their friends. So I think you hear a lot of examples and advice from other people. So I think one thing I'd say is not everything fits every situation. So sometimes you just need to think about the context you're in and which of these things can work for you. There's kind of all different scales you can get involved at, from the individual level of how you work on your projects to the sort of national, international initiatives. It's hard changing things that have been a particular way for a long time. So kind of expect that not everybody will get it instantly. But the antidote to that is to be part of a community and to have people to talk to about it, so you can go back and, after you've had your difficult conversations or your people who haven't understood, you can go back and talk to your network of people who get it, and they can tell you how they overcame the same hurdles. And sometimes it seems like it's a long way off the kind of goal of how we would like things to be, but when you kind of look back and you see how all the small steps have actually added up to some progress, it's encouraging. So I think that seems to be kind of the theme is, in whatever way makes sense for you, it's kind of up to all of us to make it happen. So that's, on the end, is just a few links to some articles and contact details and my acknowledgements. So all of this is the work of like a big community of people in the UK. Most of the things I talked about were not me personally, but a lot of other people who've made them happen. The SSI I've already mentioned, and my employer who funds my time to do these things. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Alice. I think this was the perfect keynote to kind of get us started and get us focused on what we're trying to achieve here. I think we have time for one question from the audience, if there is one. Yes, please. Hang on, I'm going to quickly pass the microphone up there. Okay.
I'm going to be provocative. I'm going to say you can replace RSE with OSS all the way through your talk, and RSE group with open source software development community, and meet most of those objectives. So what is the relationship between the RSE idea and open?
I think I'll repeat the question. So the question was that a lot of what I've talked about seems to have a lot in common with the goals of open source software communities and projects. So why do we need, could you just replace what I'd said with let's all come together as part of open source software projects rather than RSE roles or RSE teams? I mean, I think there's a lot to be said for that. I think A lot of RSEs are also leading people in open source software projects and would not see any conflict between the two. I guess one thing is that typically there's a lot of different scales. So there's some big open source software projects, and then research software kind of goes all the way down to the very niche things, the very small things that a research group needs, that will be much earlier in their life cycle or may never become a large project that you could build a community around. And so having something like a team of RSEs who can go and work directly with research groups at that very early stage is important. And if sometime over the life cycle of that software it can become an open source project and have its own community, that's like kind of one good end result. But that's not the case for all research software. But I think it's certainly not a conflict. Does that answer the question? Or?